Cool.
All right. Okay. Hey, everybody. I guess we can start with some introductions. So, thank you for coming to Finding Your Sound Eternights audio design with myself, Neha, and Ben. Um, I'll just do a quick introduction myself. Gina Zadanowitz, audio director for Serial Lab Sound and founder. I've been working in game audio for about 20 years now, so it's been quite a ride. Working on some fun games like BioShock 2 and Just Cause 3, and a bunch of indie games, especially Eternights, which was started out as a very small indie game and kind of blew up from there. And I also teach at Berklee College of Music and develop some courses there. And I've co-authored a book, the Game Audio Strategy Guide, which to try to help people get an understanding of what it's like to work in game sound. Ben or Neha?
I'll start. Hi, I'm Neha. I'm a freelance composer sound designer. I had the joy of working on Eternights with Gina. This was like almost 4 years ago. And yeah, I've been doing game audio for more or less 4.5 years now. So it was a great a gig to start with. I worked on games, well, only indie games. So Venba most recently, Six Ages, some stuff for the Playdate. And yeah, I care a lot about freelancing and sustainable game audio work and uh, keeping your Steam OST revenue for the composers out there. So I talk a lot about that.
Cool. And Ben?
Hey, I'm Ben. I am a freelance sound designer, technical sound designer, do some composing here and there. I've been like working on games, yeah, probably about 3, 4 years. Um, did sound design and technical sound design on Eternights, really fun project. Done some other games like Cave Guessers. Working on some stuff with Pato Labs currently. Was did some a little bit of music editing with PlayStation San Mateo on Spider-Man and stuff. But yeah, I've been in the US for a while now, moved over to Melbourne, Australia. So here I am on the other side of the world from probably a lot of you. But yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. So I guess we'll get started. We just have a short slide. We're mostly going to be chatting about the process organically. So I'm just going to share my screen here so that we can take a look at this. All right, looks like that's working. Um, so let's go to Eternights. So this is the game we're going to be talking about. And Eternights it's an interesting project. It's a unique blend of dating simulation and combat, hack and slash combat. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world, and the players have to balance their timing between building relationships and battling all of the monsters. Um, the the interesting thing about this is that as the players progress through the game, they try to deepen their bond with their allies. And then those allies have special combat abilities that are tied to these relationships, which makes it very cool. Um, so basically the game, it really emphasizes that sort of emotional engagement, and the audio design, we really tried to build upon those emotional connections with the characters, and really give it kind of like an anime style combat with its own unique blend, or its own unique approach to anime style combat in that way. Let's see. So one of the big things so the way this project started was Spencer Bamberg and myself were approached by a developer that we had worked with, Studio Psy. We had worked with Jay on some game. It was called Best Luck, and it was just a small puzzle game that we completed in a matter of months, and it was on itch and I believe even iOS, and it was a lot of fun. Jay had a really great knack for telling a sort of a compelling story that pulled at the heartstrings a bit. And so he brought us on to this project because we had a good relationship during Best Luck development. And so when we started with this, it was supposed to be a small indie game, and it should have been probably like a year's development. I think that was what the original contract signed us up for. And it turned into this like 3.5 year project because he ended up getting funding from a smaller indie publisher, and then Sony later on. So it was quite a wild ride. And it was interesting that we then picked up Neha and Ben along the way because it, just became more than just a two-person team in that sense. And the game's interesting, as I talked about the dating mechanic, there's mini games and the combat mechanic. And the relationship building is one of the big parts of it. So during the dating mechanic, you're interacting with the characters, and each character has their own unique story and the way that you can develop the relationship with them. But the cool tie-in is that then it unlocks these special abilities and narrative arcs. So when you are in combat, you can ask them for help with their special ability. And one of the cool things about the game is that the choices made during the interactions with the characters affect the progression of the relationships. So it can lead to different types of outcomes. So replayability, trying out, dating different characters can take you on a slightly different, path in that way. And some of the mini games are there's one like a Dance Dance Revolution type game. This one was really hard for me. I don't know about anyone else, Neha or Ben. Did you or Ben, when we were play testing, did you happen to play this mini game?
Yeah, I tried out all the mini games. That was a tough one, but eventually got used to it. I was racking up those points.
Yeah, cool. The I know the Sia bike mini game as well was pretty tough.
Mm.
But it
Oh,
was a lot of
love that
fun.
one.
Yeah,
It was really good.
very cool. Yeah. And then going into combat, so there's real-time combat where the players engage with a mix of like attacks, dodges, there's special abilities. And the player in the story loses an arm, and then that arm becomes, equipable with various different types of weapons. And so again, unlocking special abilities and upgrading skills, so kind of has that like RPG element to it. We try to really have some dynamic elements in the combat. When we talk about the audio for that and how that was processed, we'll really jump into that. The I think overall though, that's kind of just the arc of the game. Ben, Neha, is there anything that I missed in terms of just like kind of describing the game itself?
I think we're good.
All right, cool. All right, let's jump on to the next slide. So just talking about the sound design pillar here, the big thing was defining a sound palette by focusing on the critical sounds, right? So the first thing that we decided to focus on was combat. And this was prior to Ben and Neha joining the team. We had some very early iterations of, what does this sound like? And Spencer and I hadn't come from an anime background in terms of, doing games or even, media, linear media in that style. And so it made it a little bit difficult because our initial thoughts were more sci-fi, and sort of fantasy element rather than having a bit more of the anime element to it. And the dev had quite a few different, there was a Persona 5 sort of element that we were looking at for reference, but then also like Devil May Cry. And the big thing, I think, something we can talk about here is how do you take a reference and then define how that fits to the game? And also, how do you digest a reference so that you know exactly what to take away from, what the dev's giving you? If someone gives you a reference, it might be for the length of the sound or how loud it gets or the complexity or how complex the sound is. Um, in this case here, we Spencer and I came up with these pillars that we needed to hit, an emotional engagement for the players. So we needed to make sure the players felt a connection with the characters. In combat, we needed to make sure that there was this clarity and responsiveness. So audio cues that provided immediate feedback on the player's actions and the enemy responses. And then we also needed like distinct sounds for all the attacks and dodges and the special abilities, to help the players sort of react a bit more swiftly and effectively during combat. Then there was also the world building, which, I know, Neha, a lot of the world building came from the cutscenes that you had worked on. I know at one point we brought Neha on and we were like, oh, we've got all these cutscenes. And we just kind of threw them your way. And that helped with the world building because you were creating those atmospheres in the cutscene.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, luckily, I mean, Jay would give descriptions. We had this beautiful Excel sheet that I could never redo because it's beautiful. I am not really good at that. But he had these descriptions, but it was like 2, 3 sentences, sometimes one. So it was a lot of iteration and a lot of, hey, I think this is what it looks like, and almost like keeping a theme throughout, right? Because it's like I didn't actually know the whole story, right? I was just working with these little snippets, but then it still had to be cohesive. So I think having that feedback with Jane, having the feedback with you helped a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was really great too, because then we were able to, once we got to the world building in the game, we were able to just take what you had done in those cutscenes for those locations and build upon that. So we made them like living ambiences, in the world by making emitters and things like that. So that was really great. The the other thing is the dynamic mixing, which Ben, when you came in, we were doing like combat sounds and trying to get those finalized, but then also helping us with the idea of ensuring that important audio elements were always clear and impactful, and and sort of getting that strike between dialogue, music, and sound effects. So that was a really important role that you played, in addition to helping us with those additional sounds. Anything you want to say about the dynamic mixing process or element?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of just like knowing from a gameplay perspective, and this comes in mostly with the combat. What's the most important sound you want to be hearing at any moment, and ducking everything else. We had just like a ton of snapshots set up with like a bunch of like logic in the events themselves to try to get stuff out of the way when we have like some of these like important core abilities from your companions or yourself when you start leveling up and getting these big sword abilities. We really want to take away a lot of those other sounds in those moments, or even things like ambiances or footsteps and things like that maybe just aren't so important at every moment. Kind of having that balance with things with certain groups of sounds ducking other groups of sounds, and kind of being trying to figure out what's the best what's the least important, and bringing that down.
Yeah, and that was really an important part of it, because once you start throwing a lot of combat sounds into the process, things can really sound muddy, where their sounds are getting masked. If something's like low frequency, or two things are in the same frequency and they're overriding each other. And it can really feel, like it's just kind of a wall of sounds. So Ben did a really great job in sort of making sure that things were popping up using like snapshots in Fmod, and to make certain sounds duck a little bit while other sounds were playing. So there was definitely a lot of that going on. And an interesting thing is that in the very beginning, we were sort of when we were talking with Jay, Spencer and I had proposed Wise. And the reason is because we had done loads of projects with Fmod, and and we had done a smaller amount of projects with Wise. And I think for me, when we knew that this would be like a smaller project, Fmod seemed to make sense in terms of just diving in, ease of use, the linear mixer approach. And then, we were trying to think about, well, what if this project does change the scope a bit? Because Jay did have some aspirations for, finding funding and things. And we thought about, with Wise, the hierarchy approach in the mixer rather than that sort of linear approach. But it turns out in the end, a lot of times, that's the dev's choice to make the final call. So I think for us, the biggest thing that we do is we really try to learn the ins and outs of the licensing, the costs and the terms, and also have like a little pitch for the developers to say like, hey, this is how much programming time we can save you, or this is how it's going to work better for getting the audio in the game. In the end, Jay Studio Side decided to go with Fmod, and I think at the time, because this was about 4 years ago when we started, at the time, Fmod still had that nice, the free license for indies under a certain budget. And Wise at that time, at that moment, didn't have that same sort of competitive thing for indies. And so I think maybe ultimately, that was one of the reasons why we went with that. Um, Throughout the project, though, then Wise announced that they, were having a similar, licensing structure, and we were just like, we could have used that. But I think FMod worked out. I think for me, though, the linear mixer sometimes makes it difficult because we had, loads of buses, and when you have to like scroll to kind of like see how everything's set up. I don't know, Ben, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I definitely I think like with the just like visually looking at all the groups and buses and things in the mixer is kind of tough. Like it's sometimes hard to tell what's associated with what if you're not looking over at like sort of like the group folder structure.
Yeah.
Just like you have this big like board of channels in front of you. Can be hard to navigate.
Yeah, so that was like one thing that I felt like we had a little bit of difficulty working with. But like I said, I've worked on many projects with Fmod, and so I think the big takeaway there is really just knowing both tools, and even knowing some of the others that are out there like Elias, and there's CRM. I think it's CRMware. Maybe I'm saying that wrong, but there's like quite a few, and there's also some plugins out there as well that work direct in engine, that you should check out and just know, because you kind of have to pitch those to the dev. So that's an important takeaway there. Um, but here we want to kind of just talk about the evolution of the sound, the techniques of that balance of power and the emotional connection. When we first started with the sound, it was again, Jay just gave us some video capture, and I saw like the glowing sword, and I thought very fantasy like. And so I'll play a little video of some of the very early. This is like, I think it was late 2018, early 2019. And so a lot of the energy coming from that sword was just sort of like, that what I was seeing on the screen, that VFX, that made me feel like, oh, it feels like it's that kind of like slicey kind of like you hear like a little bit of like a whoom kind of as it's coming through. This is another clip of it. Let's see here. Whoops, don't want to play the same one. All right, this is another clip of early. So yeah, so that was like the very early iteration of the sound. The one thing for that sort of the impacts had this kind of like almost plasticky kind of feel to it. And that's because we were told that, the enemies had this barrier, is an invisible barrier. And in the game, when you play it, you have to eventually break the barrier down before you can get to the enemy. And so so that's what I imagined that the sound would be. But then later on, Jay had some different ideas about. Let's try this.
Stay away! I am the Ice Queen! I'll fix you up!
Yes!
Not even science can help you now!
Don't you want the world to go back to
And then let me just jump ahead to here. So here's where you can hear, we ended up giving this this heavier kind of Jay really wanted this anime sort of style impact. And so we ended up adding this this heavier kind of like punchier vibe to it. And we'll talk a little bit about how that worked when we talk about like working as a remote team. But for now, let me just play this part of it just to show you a bit more of this.
Yes!
I'll protect you, Coach! I know you would have flown.
So you can see that that we didn't have the heavy impact for the smaller enemy characters, right? So we had mini bosses and bosses, and we applied those heavier hits to the bigger bosses, and then slightly lighter one to the mini boss, and then even lighter for the regular enemy, because there are loads of them around, and it would sound really weird having all this like punchiness happening. So we had to like sort of stack the way that was set up. But yeah, I think, it evolved, and overall we were happy with how the combat sounded. And we'll talk a little bit once we talk about the remote team about how we got there. But Neha, you'd mentioned about the spreadsheets. And because we were a remote team, we had to really make use of getting lots of notes to everyone and really keeping everyone up to date on status and where we were. Any specific thoughts that you enjoyed about working with the spreadsheets and like how they were important to the process?
So for one, I've never seen a spreadsheet so up to date. And I haven't been able to recreate that for my own projects. So that there was that. There was a lot of conversation happening like in the notes section, which was kind of like funny, like, oh, I could see that Jay like updated this, and it was kind of nice to see. We didn't have that many calls with him. I think guess he was, busy on his own side of things. So
Yeah.
seeing that was great. And then we ourselves edited the document as needed. But I cannot emphasize enough how important this was to I guess synchronizing everybody, and just for my own self of like, hey, how many more hours am I gonna need for this project? I'm a freelancer. There's a lot of things going on, right? This was a very good lesson on a bigger game that synchronized all of us very, very tightly.
Yeah, and we have, I always have to thank you too, because Ben and Neha coming on as contractors for the project, it's really difficult because it wasn't we were never sure of when the work would end. So it was really difficult to like figure out where your other projects fall into that, right?
Yeah, but timing was great. It was 2020 and things were falling apart. So yeah, and Eternights was actually one of my first jobs ever. So that was really cool.
Yeah, that was really cool. I think like a little side note, a lot of people always ask, like how do you meet people and how do you chat with people? And I always say that people love hiring people they know. And I think we put out a call on Twitter just saying, look, we're looking for some fantasy sound designers or sci-fi sound designers, in this space. Send us your reels. And we got a lot of like film reels, which, didn't help because they were film music. Then we got a lot of sound design, but not as many sci-fi as we wanted. And then Neha, I remember when I saw your submission, I was like, I know you from somewhere. And we had interacted on Twitter at the time prior. And so I think for me, that sort of like kind of moved you up because it was like, oh, well, I know this person and I saw like all of the work that you were putting in on, promoting yourself on social media. And we thought it was a really good fit in that way. So it's a really good, I think, takeaway, that just making connections with people, and you never know when those connections will come into fruition or, when something will happen from that. Because I think it had been like a year since we had last chatted,
Oh,
possibly.
easily. I think we chatted before the pandemic started, like
Yeah.
a good amount before that. Because I think I only joined Twitter in 2018, so it's like the timing must have been after that. And
Yeah.
then we started on the project during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, like how that happens. And for Ben and I met at Berkeley, and I think, again, like just always putting your best self forward. Ben came across as a very like organized, very talented, but also, someone that can, get things done and really, technical stuff really nailed down. So I think, just you never know who you're meeting when you're meeting them and what they could possibly bring you onto, as far as projects go. And I think, it's been so great working with both of you and, and Neha going on to games like Venba, like, there was such success there. And Ben, like I think, you're still working with us on some projects, and I think it's just really great about like putting together people and teams. And I had this last slide before we dive into like just a real chat and questions. This was the end team for Eternights, and we James, actually, I met at NYU years ago, and I think James was great for the VO editing, the dialogue recording and editing. So James came in on the last year of development and worked with Jay with the voice talent that he was able to source. And so I think, I don't know, working remotely, just before we all dive into the conversation about it, for me, at the time it was so Ben, Spencer and myself were in Boston, and Neha in Canada, and then James was in, I think, South Carolina at the time in the US. And so for Ben, Spencer, and I, we mostly worked remotely, but we were able to have a couple of meetings at my home studio where we really just played through the game together. And, we discussed, how can we make things better? We discussed, like, we came away with like points of, you do this, I'll do that. And that's how it started coming together. And to be honest, sometimes Spencer and I would meet up and we would start throwing in sounds into Fmod. So we would start building a bit more of how the sound evolved inside Fmod, which can be bad to do because you have to really be mindful of your resource management and optimization. So you don't want to just have, add to your voice count by, like a sword swing all of a sudden has like 10 voices to it. But we started doing a lot of building there because it was easy for us to kind of move things around on the timeline and make it feel like it fits while we were connected live to Unity. So that was super helpful. in the end, because it was being ported to PS4 from PS5, we had to go back and then in our DAW just recreate those and then bounce it down into like a single asset. But for some of them, we left it, as it was, because it was really helpful for us to move around those little bits and pieces. Um, so yeah, so I'll close this out for the moment. I'll stop the screen share and we'll just have like an organic chat about how it went. And also it's a good time to post some questions to us in the chat there if anyone has any questions for any of us about the process. Let's see. And Ben, Neha, anything that you wanted to chat about while we wait for some questions to float in?
Ask away.
Yeah. I think one thing we can kind of chat about is um how did we find like a unified sound by just coming from all different areas and dropping in at different times? Because I know a lot of it was yeah, and this kind of applies to the question there, how do you find the difference working remotely versus in person? I think it's a good sort of thing to ask, right? How did we, how do you find it different? For me, I know I've worked in-house with developers and also remote. I think I'm a shyer type person, like an introvert, so I love being here with my cats and my dog named Cat. So I love being in my home studio, right? But I get out there when I have to. Like here today, just chatting and pretending to be brave. But yeah, I think like for me, it was kind of nice to be like in our own space and working, but then we got together when we needed to. I know there were some times where we were stretched so thin that we probably didn't have as much communication as we wanted to in terms of speaking to each other or jumping on a call. But the and Neha, I think probably a lot of that happened to you where you ended up having to chat more with Jay than
Mhm.
the audio director who was Spencer at the time.
Actually, yeah, I did speak a lot more to Jay than Spencer, which was
Yeah.
quite interesting, but it was very similar to my everyday experience in the sense that I've never worked in-house
Yep.
ever. I've only ever worked remotely from my bedroom, and just like Gina, I'm an extreme introvert. Like this is very difficult. And like I fake it all the time. And that includes social media actually, like just reaching people out on Twitter. That takes like it's like a stab in the heart every time. I'm like, that was exhausting. It feels like a workout. But yeah, talking with Jay actually felt similar to the other like little projects I've been on, right? Because we didn't have an audio team, it would just be me, right? So then I just talked to the programmer or the narrative designer, and that's usually kind of how it goes. So in some sense, it felt very, very familiar.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense to you. I think like when everyone started doing remote work, I think a lot of us audio folk were already doing remote work for quite a while. So when people are like terrifying remote work, we were like, we've got this, right? Um, yeah, that makes sense. So there's a question here about, editing on the timeline. Why did you choose Fmod? How is it beneficial? I think like earlier we kind of touched on the point that you really have to present your audio options and your tools to the game designer, especially in an indie team. When you work on a AAA team and you're setting up, the process, you have a bit more control in terms of the ability to tell them what you need, and a lot of times they're like, all right, let's make that happen. But for indie teams, the dev or the main person running the project has a lot more say, because they may not have the ability to dive into like the Wise API or the Fmod API. It also depends on how soon you came into the project. If you come in late in a project, they may already started scripting temp sounds and natively into the engine, and then they're not going to want to use middleware and just kind of rip all that apart and then put it into middleware. And that actually happened with Best Luck. Before we joined Jay for that project, he had already scripted some temp sounds. And when we asked about using like Fmod, because it was a small project and we thought Fmod would be great for it, But he said, no, because I already scripted all of this. So I think really, the big thing was that Jay was the one that decided we'll use Fmod because of the licensing at the time. That was the consideration. And it worked for us, right? So being able to build on the timeline, essentially you can do most of the same stuff within Fmod or Wise. I think it's the same as Unity and Unreal when people ask which is better. One is node-based, you're going to have like blueprints and there's just a different way of working in both. And so I think being familiar with both of those is helpful. Ben, Neha, do you have any thoughts on that to expand on that?
I think, well, just in regards to, so what do we, I think like Fmod, I do feel like there it does have like it's getting better and better like all the time. And I think even like throughout the project, there was a lot of sort of like new features that helped work with it. Um, in terms of just to like go to this other kind of related optimizing Fmod systems question. Um, I think like with Fmod, um, it is a lot of yeah, managing voice count, and then also just like kind of like organizational things, because Fmod, it can get kind of messy, and just like the way it looks, like we talked about the mixer, how it's just sort of a big uh list of a bunch of buses and groups and everything like that, and then in the event view, it's kind of similar. There's not like a ton of hierarchy. It's mostly like in folder structures, kind of thing. So you don't have like in Wise where the like you can do this, but like where the logic of one event is based on the logic of like a parent event or something like that. So just being kind of organized, and then, like that goes in with the spreadsheet of knowing what sound assets are used in what events, what events are triggered where, and like which like Unity scenes or circumstances or whatever. So just yeah, being really like clear about that was definitely important. And I mean, I guess like voice count is the real thing, but I do think that like there is a cool being able to layer sounds like that in an Fmod event, even though you might be sacrificing those voices. It does give you some editing freedom. It also gives you some variation freedom. You can give like different layers of a sound their own variations. Um, so then you can have like sort of like stacked variations, like maybe on a magic spell, you have a few different impacts that can all be randomly chosen, and a few different tails that can all be randomly chosen. And then you have like a whole set of permutations of different sounds that way. So I feel like having that flexibility was a really cool thing with Fmod. And you can do the same thing with Wise, but that's how we looked at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I see there's a question about before we get to the prototyping one about favorite sound gameplay audio experience that we liked working on. For me, I loved designing the Elemental Fist. To be honest, the Elemental Fist was like one of the earlier sounds besides like the sword slash that I worked on. And it had this like sort of bending metal kind of sound. So when you get the Elemental Fist ready, it does this like and then it makes the big hit sound. And for me, that was the most fun because it defined the idea that, Jay wanted this anime, but I also wanted this like darker, gritty element that kind of goes along with the world. So for me, that was the one of my favorites. Ben, Neha, did you have any favorites that you worked on?
I had this cinematic where well, I don't want to spoil too much because in case, but there was like these two like, ghost-like spirits that came up on the sides of the character, and there was a train moving, and that ethereal, like scary, but it's not a horror. I mean, there's scary elements, but it's not just a horror game, right? But being able to put something a little bit more creepy, a little bit more like out of this world, was very satisfying. I think everything with shield breaking, that glass like icy sounds was really fun. And anytime I got to do more gory sounds, because I really like gore, like it's just there's something so satisfying about gore. I don't like seeing it, but I love hearing it.
And there was plenty of that.
Oh yeah.
Uh, Ben, yeah, did you have a favorite?
Yeah, I think this game, like the way the combat system is set up, kind of gave a lot of opportunities for like fun sound design. There's a lot of like we talked about the elemental fist and the shield and stuff like that. There's a lot of moments where kind of everything drops out and then there's this big like sound that happens, or this big moment that happens. And that's with the companion characters as well, which have a lot of like magic spells that are kind of elemental based. There's like a fire and ice, electric, and a healing one. So kind of like getting to dive into those moments, like with like the healing character and like kind of what's like an epic heal kind of thing. What's like a that kind of feeling of it feels like big anime, super like tonal and exciting, but it's also like you're getting your health back kind of thing. So that I think playing with the companion abilities was really fun.
Yeah, those brought a lot of life to the game, especially like really nailing like the physical characteristics like of the ice and the fire. All of that was really great. One thing that you mentioned, the idea with Elemental Fist, where it's a big moment and all the other sounds duck out of the way. That was interesting because Spencer was working on the music at the time, and initially we both went away and designed the Elemental Fist like a small scene, the sequence of how it works. And so you select in the UI, you select, the ability that you're going to choose, and then it does this whole like process with the character, kind of a little bit of a slow motion element to it. And I think one of the big things was that Spencer came back with like all this musical cue for it, and I came back with this big sound, that bending metal kind of sound. And we had to decide, like which one sort of takes center stage. And in the end, I think, and this is something for composers and even sound designers, if we had chose that, the music portion was the best part for the game to tell that story and to fit the feedback to the player, then I would have been fine taking the sound down and letting the music run with it. But as a team with Jay, we decided that the sound design needed to be there, and so we took out that musical cue. So I think it goes to show, like as a composer and sound designer, like checking your ego about, your sounds always have to be at the top like that. I think that's a really important one. Another question. So Ben and Neha, what studies did you undertake before diving into the Eternights process?
Ooh, I studied classical piano in my undergrad at a very strict conservatory, so it's not like I could talk about game audio or film music or just video game music. Like there was this I didn't study composition like properly. There's this prof that had said to my friend that monkeys can compose film music, so I was too scared to ever bring it up to anybody that I wanted to do video games. So like I just started doing game jams on the side a lot, and everything game audio related has been Twitter, YouTube, and yeah, I think that's it. Twitter and YouTube.
Yeah, the game jams I think are an important part of the process when you're starting out. I even do some of them now, even like 20 years into my career. I think what's one really great thing about a game jam that you take away from it?
Oh man, it just forces you to get stuff done. Like I had no, so composition as a pianist, like it came naturally, right? And I took like a little bit of composition classes like here and there. But sound design, I had literally nothing, 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 nothing. So being put in a game jam, and I was a student, right? With a bunch of other students who are, crunching, they're busy, and they want sound, but they don't actually care about sound, right? Means that it's all on you and you need to get, stuff done. So it felt like I got most of my chops from being forced. I'm not saying do crunch, but it just felt like as a student, everybody was doing it. And so I did it. But it felt like in a short amount of time, I have to like bring out assets, just export, export, export. And it kind of taught me a lot that just to produce, and the more you produce, like it was like these new skills I was learning, right? So I think that was the sound design. I attribute 100% to game jams because I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for just being forced. You're in the situation where you are forced to output.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kick in the butt that I needed to learn.
Yeah, I always say that practice is really important. I often still to this day give myself like if I find like I'm having a slow like week for business, I'll give myself like an exercise or a challenge because I think that's the best way to keep yourself sort of sharp with things. And Ben, you want to tell us about your studies a bit?
Yeah. So I went to Berkeley doing film scoring. That's where I met Gina. She was teaching me some game audio stuff there. So that's where I got a lot of the foundational, just in terms of writing music or like digital audio basics kind of stuff, as well as game audio basic stuff. But it really is a lot of tutorials and things like that for sure. Like I think like I'm still like going through people's tutorials all the time. Whenever like someone posts something new and it's like, oh, like how I made this like whatever cool sound and go through it, see if I can re recreate it, that kind of thing. I think game jams are also like is super important. I definitely agree. Like just in terms of learning how to work with other people and like yeah, like Neha was saying, like just the being kind of the advocate for the sound like department, I guess, which is such a reality, I feel like in indies especially. If you're by yourself, you get like the way that sound will exist in the project kind of has to be determined by you and how much you're willing to push for it. Um, so I think like getting that kind of experience and also just like seeing the other parts of game development in a micro scale on a game jam. Since you're like you're there with everybody, you can kind of you can get a like taste of like what the programming looks like, what the art looks like, those game design, that kind of stuff, and you can participate if your team is cool, like into those areas a little more. But and then yeah, like practicing, like doing little tests. If I hear a sound in a game or something that it's like, oh, that's super cool. A lot of the time I'll like try to recreate that sound. And even if I don't get all the way there, I definitely always like learn something in that process. So a lot of yeah, just practice, just like any skill. I feel like practice is the thing.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point that you made was in the game jams, checking out what the other parts of the process is. And there's a question here about prototyping process between animation, art, and sound. What are the workflows and pipelines? I think we all know that audio oftentimes comes at the end of the process because the art and animation needs to be somewhat complete. But I think you can advocate for yourself where you can ask to see concept because you can start designing that way. I think that's an important process. So we were asking for a lot of, a lot of the early animations, a lot of the early art, the concepts of the characters, so we can do like a lot of pre-production. The one funny thing I remember is that with the cutscenes, because they were in-game cutscenes, so they were rendered in the engine. So there wasn't like a specific video that we had from an animator. So Jay would do video capture of the cutscene and then send it over to us. And we found that things were very off sync once in the game. And that's because we didn't truly know exactly where the or where the event actually started that would trigger this sound. And so it was really interesting because it was a combination of the some of the in-game sounds plus some of the sounds we were adding as part of like this cutscene overlay. And so it was part linear and part interactive or non-linear. And Neha, I remember I came up with the idea that we would add like a short like sine wave beep so that Jay can put it into the game and then we would know exactly that's where you start to line up for the cutscene.
I just remember the beep and it's like, yeah, I remember that famous beep.
And how did you feel like did it help you to figure out like
Oh,
where?
absolutely. Absolutely. Like that beep was great. It does get very annoying, but like I completely forgot about that. And I'm just you mentioning it, it's like, oh no, that beep. But
Yeah,
no, it was really useful and actually I use it in my own projects now. Like I
yeah,
have a fake even in Y, like I'll use Wise a lot and I'll have like an event called the beep.
yeah.
And it's just a fake beep event and it's very, very useful.
Yeah, because the sine wave is going to really cut through any other sounds. So it's always going to be there. And also you're going to be able to see the waveform of it nice and chunky. It sticks out really well. You're going to be able to see like the initial transient of it. So it's really the best sound to use. And we ended up using that for some of the combat as well. We even tried it with some of the footsteps because for some reason, some of the footsteps were off sync for a little bit. And it really helped us to just having an event called beep, and then Jay could swap that in and out wherever needed, just by changing the code. And it was a sort of a lifesaver for us in that process. In terms of the rest of that prototyping process, a lot of it was, receiving animations or getting game capture ourselves from the game, and then just, creating the sound. And then in those spreadsheets that we were talking about earlier, we actually had like a section where we would deliver a link with, our sound kind of painted over the video capture that we had. And then we would get approval from Jay. Then it would go in game. And just as we all know, sometimes when you see something out of context in a small animation, sounds amazing and it works well. But then when you play it in game and it's triggering, a bunch of times over and over, sometimes it gets kicked back again for revision. So that was kind of our process. We wait for animation and sound, or sorry, wait for animation and art, but we also wanted to make sure that we did see those early versions so we can get started and, we didn't have to crunch so hard in that sense. Ben, Neha, did you have any other thoughts on the prototyping process?
I think one thing that was really helpful once we got it is I think that Jay was super passionate. He had a lot of the time rocket ahead with working on stuff, taking our sounds and putting them in, and it wasn't always super clear what sounds were triggering when and in relation to what what was triggering certain sounds because it didn't always happen to line up with the original intention. And I think when we request, like we got a lot of developer tools eventually. I remember there being like a lot, we really advocated for that. Just being able to trigger different moves from the enemies, not relying on their AI to like, oh, hopefully it'll like, once I get to phase 3 of this fight, it'll do its big move and I'll finally hear that. We got those tools to really test those things. And I think something like that's really important. Just being able to, especially on larger projects, having robust developer tools that help you do your job like with audio, just speeds things up a ton and really helps you, like, make sure that the sounds are right for the game, or you're getting the capture you need, or just knowing how the sound is working. I think that was super
Yeah.
helpful.
That's a really good point. We did ask for loads of tools, and sometimes, devs might say, "Oh, it's going to take away from development time," but it really saves in the end, because it can be really difficult if you aren't able to, if you have to go through the whole game just to hope that you trigger a specific attack from an enemy. So that was, I remember that really started to speed up the process for like the enemy sounds, attacks, the player attacks. We were able to just kind of trigger those in a specific world or location in the game that was specific for sound. So that was kind of fun. We had our own branch in GitHub, and we were able to kind of have those little bits of tools. So that was really nice. And anyone else have anything about the process in any way before we jump on to how many sounds we recorded ourselves? All right. So for me, I know I love recording sounds. I started out life as a composer and dove into sound design. I remember when I was very young, I asked my mom for a synth, and my parents took me over to the big box store, and we got a synth, and I just would lock myself in my room making sounds, and so recording them and things like that. So for me, I love generating a lot of my own source in that way. And here in my home studio, I have like a Foley room where I'm able to go and record things. So loads of recordings on my side went into it. There's still always a good mix of sound library usage because there's certain things that maybe you can't capture especially like things like fire. I try not recreating those. Although I do have to say this, I like to get library sounds. Like let's say, for example, an explosion. I'll take the explosion sound from the library and I'll then record a couple of like debris type stuff. So like if it's rocks that are falling or, you know, there's bits of metal that are being thrown from the explosion, I like to add those in to the recording, the sound library that I'm licensing. It just helps make it unique. It helps avoid, you know, the fact that it's like, hey, that's my sound in the game from the library. You know, there's nothing wrong with if a sound really works, you know, but and dropping it in. But I just love like just making things as unique to the need, you know, or the requirement of the game as possible. So there were loads of things. Yeah, there were loads of things that I recorded. There was this one scene where it was in there's a few different like black fade to black scenes where then we had to recreate almost like a like kind of miming of what someone's doing. And so they were just sound based. So you had to kind of, while the scene turned black, there was a little bit of text. And there was this one part where I had to fumble around in a bunch of tools. And then one of the tools gets dropped, like a wrench, I think it was, or a hammer. And so I had my wife come and she often, you know, if I'm the only one here, if Spencer or when Ben was here, if no one was around, I would have her come and like, you know, perform like Foley, you know, elements. So like we've got to drop these, you know, tools and doing lots of fun stuff like that. There's like a shop area where I ended up never seeing it in game, but I think it might have been another one of those like fade to black scenes. But there was like a shop area where you're touching stuff as the player on a shelf. So I went into like the pantry and I just started like grabbing bags of chips and, you know, like nuts and like things and just making all these sounds. So it's a lot of fun for me. I love it. I've always loved just like recording types of sounds and, you know, things like that. I remember just kind of a side note, you know, my parents had this, they came to visit one time and we bought this rotisserie chicken to eat for a meal. And I went and was like, oh, I could use this for the zombie game that I'm recording. So I went in and started like cutting it up. And then I went upstairs to dump all the sounds from my recorder. And I hear my mom yelling, and she's from Jersey. So she's just like, Gina, she's like, the cats got in the chicken. But it was really me. So I was standing there like, I love my cats. I can't make them throw them under the bus for this. Um, so I ended up saying, you know, I had to record this, you know, so it was kind of fun. We did eat it because we didn't want to waste it, you know, and I promised that I had washed my hands. But that kind of stuff is just, I don't know, I just love it. Ben, Neha, did you have any fun like with recording assets for for any of the scenes and the sounds?
So I'm on the opposite end. I don't enjoy recording sounds at all. And so I did not for this project. And usually I don't. I think it's the process of like, you know, setting up. I guess maybe my setup isn't efficient. Like I know it's not efficient, but having to, you know, get my Zoom, make sure the room is quiet enough, and then having to record that, then take the little SD card out and like plug it in and, you know, redoing the whole thing just feels like I rarely do it. So no, I did not record sounds. I like designing sounds, I just don't like recording them.
Yeah, so you're still not just taking from a library, you're just doing it with different source. You're just layering
Mhm.
and editing things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ben, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I think like I tried to have kind of a balance there. I think that I recording sounds is like a pretty fun. I mean, it gets me out of like the studio, which is fun for me. But that is true. It is like another like layer of like the whole process of editing and cleaning up your recordings to be actually usable in your library and everything. So that sometimes does slow it down. But I think like what you were saying earlier about the those moments where it fades to black, those kind of visual novelty moments. For me, were definitely times where I was like, okay, like this is like I think there's like a locker slamming closed or something like that, or there's like a few other, maybe there's like a rubber band one or something. And then those kinds of things I was able to just find something around the house that was kind of applicable to that kind of thing. And I think even it was mentioned here in the chat with the papery source can be fire kind of thing. I think I definitely that like right there, like paper or clothing kind of has that texture when processed can be kind of like fiery or explosiony or even like goopy depending on the processing you did. So I did a little bit of that. For a lot of the magic stuff, I just went ahead and learned how to do fire spells and ice spells and just recorded those and threw them in the game. So that actually sped up the process a lot. Was learning to do magic. But I mean, yeah, I think like it's I definitely took stuff from libraries too. Try not to do direct like drops, like a sound unprocessed. Like Gina said, kind of like chopping stuff up, maybe taking the transient from one, like the body from another explosion, then like the tail from a few other like debris recordings, and taking putting that all together, processing it, so it really feels bespoke and for the exactly what it is in the game. But yeah, so I think definitely like a balance with that.
Yeah. Let's see. So what suggestions would you give about theme related to recorded library? What themes are missing still? If you mean like with the libraries that are out there, I think one thing that's really great about living in these times is that there's all of these really great sort of smaller bespoke libraries that are out there. If you go to like, Boom Sound Library, and also asoundeffect.com. There's loads of like small boutique sound effects libraries that kind of really cover loads of stuff. When I started, about 20 years ago, there were these giant libraries that you'd have to buy for, thousands of dollars. And you would get like a ton of like generic sounds and some more specific like vehicle sounds and animals and things like that. But I think now more than ever, we have loads of really great stuff. Like there's almost anything you can think of, you can search for, and someone's recorded some library for it. I think the, I would say, as far as missing, I would say I'd probably want more iterations on some of the libraries. For example, Thomas Rex Beverly, he's a field recordist, and he goes out and records basically he bowed cacti, so cactus, took different bows to cactus and came out with some really incredible sounds for that I ended up using in a an audio production drama. Um, yes, they were on CDs then. That was kind of DVDs, something like that. Yeah. You had to like load them into your computer and then save them onto a hard drive. And then eventually you can buy them on hard drive, and then they went to online, which is so much easier. Ben, Neha, is there any like kind of missing themes in libraries that you can think of?
I guess for me specifically, well, when I worked on Venba, I wanted very specific. That's the one time in my life I actually recorded almost like an entire library for myself, and it was for Indian cooking sounds. But that's because I'm very tuned up of I know what our food sounds like. I know the tempering. So tempering is when you have oil, you put whole seeds in it and it explodes. But it's not an explosion sound. It's very specific to like my home, my mom, my childhood, upbringing. So sounds that are very, very specific and very nostalgic to me, I realized that I do have to record those. And so yeah, so that was missing definitely.
Actually, that's a really good point. The sort of idea of like cultural appreciation, we talk about that in music often, but sound, it's sort of the same thing. I think one of the big things, I was doing some falconry one time where it's like an experience where you can go and wear this big glove and the falcon comes and lands on you. And it was all done very mainly, and it was a really good experience. But the guy running the experience had said, those sound people, they always put the wrong birds in the films, and he's like, I can't stand it. And he he was pretty annoyed by it. But I did say to him that there's two thoughts to that process. One is that yes, there's probably some people that don't know, like, oh, this is that bird, this is what it sounds like, or maybe they don't have the proper library. I said, but really what we're out to do is create sound that really fits uniquely to the project, right? For feedback to the player, but also immersion into the game. So sometimes, I've used a hawk sound for an eagle, because have you ever heard an eagle cry? If you haven't, or an eagle call, look it up. It doesn't sound as majestic as the eagle looks, right? So really not threatening. So if you take a black-tailed hawk, or is it brown-tail maybe? I forget which kind of tail hawk it was. But basically taking that sound and blending it a little bit with a little bit of the eagle, it really helps it feel more threatening and bigger and have more power. So Neha, with the cooking sounds, you really nailed it, because you knew like all of those little intricacies that happen with the process, right?
Yeah, and like your the eagle sound, right? I think it brings us back to the what's always real isn't like satisfying.
Yeah.
So you could be authentic, but then it's like, well, it doesn't sound good, right?
Yes, red tail.
It's
I
not
don't know.
satisfying. Like I think for us, it's like the player experience goes a bit, above everything else. So even though, I mean, sometimes it's okay to not be authentic, and that's all right.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think, yeah, that's part of the process, though, right? The idea is that it doesn't always have to be what it is, because, we're going off into this imaginary world. It doesn't always have to be exact. Just like when you're watching a movie and the coders, they're always like typing like a million miles per hour. I do a tiny bit of scripting, and I don't type like that when I'm doing it, right? I don't know about anyone else, but I think it's always just for the entertainment. And so sometimes exaggeration helps. But I did love hearing all about, like, I've seen a bunch of the talks you've done about the process of going and recording all the food and stuff. And I played the game, and I think it works really well. It gives that sort of authentic experience.
Well, thank you. But I also like, even for the authentic experience, I would sometimes add some library sounds just to thicken up, right? Just to give it that oomph that we kind of like lack sometimes. So yeah. Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it looks like we have about 5 minutes. There's been some really great questions. Does anyone have any last question that we can jump into before we head off? It's been really great having these questions and seeing the chat, having people be active in the conversation. Oh, I like that. Eagles sound like squeaky shopping cart wheel. That's very true. Let's see. Yeah, so just type us the last question if you have it. I'm trying to see if I missed any questions. I think we did okay with answering them. Any last things, Neha and Ben, that you'd like to say as we sort of close out and wrap up?
This was a great project to start on. Like this was awesome.
Yeah,
Definitely a lot of fun. Yep.
Yeah.
definitely. Like I mean, this was a really cool project to dive into. It was my first one right out of graduating. I think you had contacted me like a few weeks before graduating. So yeah, it was a really cool project. Um, how does sound licensing work?
Yeah, I think for sound licensing with libraries, I think the big thing is always read the long sort of licensing, or read the license, because I think not every library works the same way. So I think that's going to be really important that you understand what you're working with and how it works. Most of the time, you're okay if you get the license and then you're editing the sound and then you're delivering that to your client. But I think technically you shouldn't be just taking sounds and then, charging your client for them and just giving it to them. So typically that's like kind of how libraries do and don't work. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that in 3 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's it. Yeah, like just knowing what the license you've like purchased allows you to do,
Yeah.
um, and allows you to provide to other people. Like, are you like, can you give a license to the these sounds to someone else for their commercial product kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an important part of it. So yeah, really, I definitely recommend reading through all of that and understanding how it all works, their facts and their license. I know a lot of times we like to just click because there's so much text, but it's really important in that case so that because you'd be responsible for the anything that comes into using it incorrectly. But I think overall this has been really fun. We don't want to go over time because it's YouTube Day. And I know there's some other talks people want to get to, but I want to personally thank everyone for joining us. And I want to thank Ben and Neha for joining me. It's not only great having you on the team, but also great to continue to see you both thriving in the industry. Yeah, anyone else have a farewell?
Oh yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Gina, for bringing us all
Yeah.
together.
It was a great team. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you out there. Or I know there's a hangout space that maybe we'll see you there as well. So thank you.